3 years ago, I downloaded Linux. I switched from Windows because Microsoft wouldn't support Windows 10 anymore. I remember at the time being frustrated with the system requirements and Microsoft's general behavior around AI, like, look at how that's going. So I made the switch. Even though I had heard people talk about how they bricked their laptops or how they bricked their computers because they installed Linux and something didn't work, but I didn't really care. I was upset. And so in a fit of rage, I went to Target, bought the cheapest flash drive I could, and installed Linux Mint on it. Then, before I knew it, I was installing Linux on the school Wi-Fi in my dorm. 3 years later, and I haven't ever looked back at Windows. Every time I touch a Windows machine, I kind of shudder because it's just so different. The experience of using Windows is just completely different. The only reason I chose Linux Mint in the first place was because it's just what I had heard about. I didn't know what a kernel was. I didn't know that much about computers, even though I was a computer science student. Boy, did that really humble me, right? I got really comfortable with the terminal, but it took a long time and a lot of Googling. I got better at troubleshooting my own issues because I was forced to. Now a lot of people in my life say I'm one of the best troubleshooters around, but it's only because I forced myself to do it. In actuality, I think using Linux is actually smoother than using Windows these days, but it didn't feel that way at first. There were just so many apps that you just can't use. I remember I had a class where there was this software, I don't even remember what it was called, some kind of visualization software, and it was proprietary, so I tried to run it with Wine, which, by the way, if you've never used Wine, it's the thing that makes Steam accessible on all of these devices. It's why we have the modern Linux space, is because Wine is a compatibility layer. It stands for Wine is not an emulator, which is true. It's a compatibility layer. What it does is it translates system calls from applications into Linux kernel calls. What that effectively allows us to do is run Windows apps on Linux. 90% of the time, Wine is perfect. That last 10% of the time is where I was. And even at the time, in 2023, Wine was not as good as it is now. This one specific app, I don't understand what the frustrating part of that was, or why that app just didn't work. But no matter what I did with Wine, nothing seemed to work. I don't even remember what I wound up doing. I think I wound up using Python matplotlib because that's just kind of what I know. And I think I got a decent grade in that class. But that's the reality of using Linux in a school environment that wasn't prepared for that, right? You just have to troubleshoot it yourself sometimes. I used Linux Mint with the Cinnamon desktop for like 3 years. I think I even got Gnome'd at one point. If you're not familiar, getting Gnome'd is when, if you're using a Debian-based or specifically an Ubuntu-based operating system, as Linux Mint is, sometimes you'll install a package which will install some GNOME, might even install the entire desktop environment, and then you reboot, and then all of a sudden you're in GNOME. I don't even remember how I fixed that. I didn't even know it was a term until very recently, but that's just one of the things that can happen to you if you use a Ubuntu or a Debian-based distribution, since GNOME is just so built in to those distributions. But I used Linux Mint Cinnamon as my main thing for 2 years, until December of last year when I got my main rig. I decided I'm going to be bold. I'm going to install Arch Linux. Even though I used the generic Python script, Arch install, I got humbled really quickly. Mostly because I'd never really needed to use the terminal at that point. Even though I'd done very basic things like changing directories, making new directories, editing files from the command line with Vim, I had never really needed to do that. I didn't understand a kernel module or how the kernel worked. All I knew was that I wanted to just say that I ran Arch Linux. I even picked probably the worst desktop environment for that, XFCE. Probably the worst desktop environment you could pick. It's on the X11 display server, which is a legacy display server. The support for Chinese characters on X11 is just horrible. I'm also a Chinese student, so I need to type Chinese characters, and One of the things you learn very quickly is that X11 is really bad for Chinese character support. At some point, I decided, man, fuck this. I'm going to go to KDE Plasma, which I've been hearing so much about. So I went to KDE Plasma. For a while, that worked for me. I did it on my laptop, too, which I also installed Arch Linux on, just to say that I did. I did that one manually. That was a mess, too. I didn't read the wiki right, and so what wound up happening is that for a long time, I was using the open source drivers on an unsupported graphics card, so a lot of things were quirky, and I didn't know what the problem was until finally just a couple weeks ago, I read the wiki, and it said, this graphics card is unsupported. I said, for anyone curious, it's the ThinkPad P50 with the Quadro M2000. The Maxwell architecture, which is what the M stands for, it's supposed to use the proprietary 580 drivers, but I just didn't know that because I didn't read the wiki. So that's a lesson learned. Read the wiki. Well, so anyways, I used KDE Plasma on my devices for a little while, and then I said, I'm tired of having to drag the windows around so that I can make tiling myself. So I said, well, I've heard about this Hyperland thing. Let me go try Hyperland. In hindsight, I don't recommend Hyperland. There are so many better tiling display managers than Hyperland. I used Hyperland very, very briefly until I switched to Sway. Now I'm running Niri because I like that tiling display manager, but I also like the infinite effect of Niri. And I like the Wayland compositor, and I like Wayland in general because it's better for Chinese characters. But that's one of the beauties of Linux, right? Is that it's completely customizable. I picked and chose what parts of the operating system I actually wanted. I picked the display manager and the Chinese characters. I pick what apps are installed, and I can uninstall apps I don't want. I even picked the file system that my system runs. I'm using Btrfs. I think on my next build, I'm going to run ZFS or XFS, or maybe on the server that I'm hoping that I'll have soon. I'm also running Arch Linux on my home server, just because at this point I've done so much with Arch and systemd that I understand quite deeply how it works, but one of my goals is to get away from systemd just to see how it works. But I think that's the beauty of Linux, right? I was able to completely customize everything that I wanted. It became about my focus and my intentions, and it allowed me to cultivate a desktop experience that would make me feel good in a way that Windows doesn't. That's part of the problem, is that when I go to Windows, I'm just reminded of you have to do things the Windows way. We often criticize GNOME in the Linux community for GNOME knows best. Well, it's the same thing with Windows, except it's even worse. Obviously, if you stop Windows Explorer, you're done. The entire desktop is gone. That's, I think, the beauty of Linux. The customizability and the open source mindset. I understand that open source is not wholly open. What I mean by that is that it's not just people sitting in chairs like I am contributing to open source. In fact, most of open source is contributed by white-collar people hired by Red Hat or IBM, and their only job at that point basically is to contribute to FFmpeg or contribute to systemd. And even though those things are open source and you can go read the source code and contribute to yourself, even though all of that is true, it's still true that what actually powers the open source software is money, fundamentally. And that's unfortunately true about most things in life. But it's still a beautiful message, right? As opposed to everybody having to conceive of and build their own proprietary thing so that as consumers we have no choice over that. Instead, what we have is a blossoming ecosystem of open source things for everybody that you can pick and choose. No need to be bound down to systemd when you could just uninstall it. No need to be bound to sudo when you could just use do as instead. That, I think, is the true beauty of Linux. So I encourage you to give it a try as well. Try something simple like Linux Mint or Ubuntu, something with a lot of support. And then as you grow in your skills, start to consider what you need, what would make you happy. Because even with these distros that come plug and play, like Linux Mint, like Ubuntu, you can still customize them however you like.